People laughed when they saw an old, scratched pickup truck roll into Silverwind International Airport, leaving behind a faint trail of dust in the still, unclear dawn. The car door swung open. A man stepped out. His dark work clothes were stained with oil and dust, his boots caked with dirt, his shirt frayed at the shoulders, and his sturdy hands looked as if he had just stepped out of an old country workshop. That was Hudson Blake, an ordinary mechanic in the eyes of everyone standing behind the thick glass. The executives in navy blue suits, with meticulously tied ties and shiny leather shoes, looked at him with undisguised mockery. My God, who did they call a tractor-fixing cowboy? Perhaps laughter erupted. Someone even took out their phone to record it. The contrast was too stark not to ridicule. The silver private jet stood imposing on the runway, silent as a corpse, a symbol of power, speed, and wealth. Yet the person summoned to fix it looked as if he wasn't even qualified to enter the technical area. No one believed he could even touch the aircraft, let alone fix it. But among the dozens of scornful eyes, only one person didn't laugh. She didn't mock. She didn't shake her head. She didn't turn away. She just stood silently. That was Isla Harrington, the heiress to the Horizon Jetstream aviation empire, one of the most powerful female CEOs in America, known as the Sky Princess, with hundreds of aircraft and thousands of employees under her command. She was not a person easily moved. She was used to admiration, lies, and perfect performances her entire life. Yet at that moment, her eyes were fixed on the mechanic who looked like he had stepped out of some old, worn diary. There was something about Hudson that Isla couldn't look away from. It was the way he walked, without rushing, without cowering. It was his eyes, as calm as if the world had laughed at him his whole life, so nothing could surprise him anymore. It was his quiet but steady posture, as if he understood what lay beneath the metal shell of that plane better than any engineer with diplomas hanging on their wall. And in just a few more minutes, Isla herself would step out onto the runway, stop all the laughter, the calls, the speculation, and ask a single question, a question that would change the rest of their two lives. As for those who were mocking, they would witness something they never believed. Some things don't need looks or reputation to make the whole world fall silent. 6:07 a.m. The sky was not yet fully bright. The dawn still held a bruised purple-blue color on the horizon. The air at Silverwind was cold and dry, the wind hissing through every crack in the terminal, blowing old newspapers across the ground. Hudson Blake had woken up before the sun. The call came at 5:11 a.m. Jet won't start. Engine failure. Urgent attention needed. Will pay well. No client name, no specific location other than an airport code and runway coordinates. To a normal person, it was a suspicious warning, but to Hudson, it was routine. He didn't fix machines for money, but because he couldn't stand to see something dying while no one saved it. He grabbed his old flannel shirt, tucked a few familiar hand tools into his bag, and climbed into his 1987 Chevy, a truck with an engine so old that many garages refused to work on it, except for him. The battered vehicle rattled along, crossing the dirt road on the edge of town, and turned into the airport's auxiliary security gate, the one for technical staff and cargo. A security guard looked at the license plate, frowning, about to call for a check. But when Hudson showed him the work order, the man paused. "You're the one called from Sky Emergency Repair." "That's right," Hudson answered curtly. The other man nodded, reluctantly letting him through. On the other side of the gate was another world. The private jet, a metallic silver, a Falcon 10X model worth nearly $80 million, stood motionless in the middle of the runway like an iron beast forgotten in a forest of people in designer clothes. A group of about 10 people, all senior engineers and technical directors, stood around the plane. They wore company jackets, polished shoes, and sunglasses, even though the sun wasn't out. They were talking about the restaurant last night, today's stock prices, and someone had just asked Siri, "What percentage of engine failures on planes are due to fuel?" No one paid attention to the man who was quietly approaching with an old tool bag and worn-out boots. Hudson didn't greet them. He wasn't used to saying hello first. He placed his bag under the belly of the plane, bent down, and opened the left engine cover, where the error signals were recorded in the emergency repair order. And right at that moment, he froze. What he saw made the blood in his veins slow for a beat. The fuel line was cracked. Not just cracked, but melted. The connector was deformed as if it had been heated to a high temperature. The insulation wrap was torn. And worse, it was less than an inch from the main ignition coil. One spark, one wrong vibration. The entire aircraft could have exploded at an altitude of 12,000 meters. Hudson took a deep breath. He clenched his hands, not out of fear, but out of anger. Someone had done a shoddy repair. A certified technician would never use a rusty iron clamp like that. Whoever touched this plane last, he wasn't just careless. He might have inadvertently signed the death warrant for all its passengers. Hudson looked around. No one was paying attention to him. One was on the phone, another was live streaming on Instagram, calling a plane mechanic who looks like he's from a roadside tow service. Ha ha. He turned back to his bag. No modern equipment, just the set of tools he had used since he was 19. A replacement rubber hose, pliers, a screwdriver, heat-resistant tape, and some copper wire. He rolled up his sleeves. At that moment, he knew he had exactly 17 minutes before the sun rose higher, when the fuel would begin to expand due to the heat, and then a small impact could turn the entire aircraft to dust. But he didn't think too much. Hudson wasn't the type to stop and analyze the risk. He just fixed things. That's what he had done his whole life. Hudson bent lower, his knees resting directly on the cold, rough tarmac of the runway. From his old frayed bag, he pulled out a roll of heat-resistant tape, a new clamp, and a piece of flexible tubing that he himself had reinforced weeks ago. He didn't look up, didn't respond, didn't need to know who was watching, because he knew that look. The look he'd been familiar with since he was 17, when he applied for his first job at a big city garage, and the owner looked him up and down and said, "A face like yours is only good for changing oil." Back then, Hudson didn't reply. Just like now, he just fixed. The sun was gradually rising, its light slanting through the glass of the distant terminal, casting the shadows of the men in suits standing inside, still talking and laughing. One of them, who appeared to be the technical manager, was quietly live streaming, pointing his phone at Hudson as if recording a rare and interesting oddity. This is how an $80 million jet gets saved by a mechanic from a Clint Eastwood movie, he sneered in the video. A few younger engineers standing near the plane began to whisper, "Does he even know what he's doing? Looks like he just walked out of an abandoned gas station." Hudson heard it all, not because they were speaking loudly, but because they wanted him to hear. But every laugh, every jeer seemed to only make his hands steadier. No trembling, no hesitation. Because he wasn't fixing for recognition. He was fixing because someone had to do the right thing, just a few hundred steps away. On the second floor of the magnificent glass building, Isla Harrington still stood there, her gaze as if drawn to every movement of the man in the early morning sun. At first, she too was skeptical. How could someone who looked like he'd walked off the last page of a small town's history dare to touch her engine? But when she saw how Hudson checked every detail, not loudly, not showing off, but with the precision of a surgeon, she suddenly paused. She had lived her whole life among people who knew how to talk big, but she had never seen anyone say so much with silence. He didn't need to explain to anyone. The engine just needed to understand him. And it did. A beep sounded. The pressure gauge began to light up again. The light flickered like the heartbeat of the jet just waking from a coma. The engineers who had been laughing suddenly fell silent. One of them stepped forward to look at the gauge, his face turning pale. No way. He stabilized the fuel pressure system. A faint whirring sound came from the body of the plane, then silence, and then the auxiliary engine started. The sound was as soft as a first breath after a long coma. Hudson sat quietly, wiping sweat with the back of his dusty hand, then slowly screwed the engine cover back on. He didn't smile, said nothing, didn't raise his head to look at the crowd that had just mocked him. Just one hand grabbing the strap of his bag, the other wiping grease on his shirt, and stood up as if saving a multi-million-dollar aircraft was just a normal part of his day. But before he could turn away, the plane door opened. The distinct click-click of the metal stairs echoed, sharp as a bell in the quiet morning. And then Isla Harrington stepped down, without a word of warning. No announcement, no bodyguards. She descended the stairs as if stepping out of the very image people had assigned her for a lifetime. The heel of Isla Harrington's shoe touched the final step with a dry, sharp sound that echoed across the tarmac like an invisible declaration. She wore a custom-tailored dark blue suit, its gold buttons gleaming faintly in the newly risen sun. Her hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her expression as serious as if she were about to enter a multi-million-dollar shareholder meeting. But her eyes were different. They were locked on the man who was about to turn and walk away. Hudson paused, his hand still gripping the strap of his bag. He saw her from the corner of his eye, but didn't turn completely, as if still unsure if what he was seeing was real. The people behind the glass seemed to stop breathing. The engineers on the tarmac hastily corrected their posture, a few of them shrinking back against the plane's fuselage as if trying to escape an impending storm. But Isla didn't look at them. She walked past them all. Left behind were the people who had jeered, the people who had surrounded her like a prestigious honor guard, the people who thought they knew best how to keep her under control. She just walked toward Hudson, saying nothing, needing no greeting. When she stood before him, less than an arm's length away, Isla stopped. Her eyes swept lightly over his face, over the oil stains on his shirt collar, over the trace of sweat on his temple, and finally settled on his eyes, calm, deep, and unafraid. "You fixed it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but as clear as a command. Hudson nodded, simply, "I did. My chief pilot said the engine was severely damaged, that the entire fuel system needed to be replaced, and it would take at least a week. He missed a melted spot. The fuel line was near the ignition coil, risk of in-air explosion. I just did what needed to be done." Isla frowned, not out of anger, but out of realization everything she had trusted was wrong. "You could have left. No one forced you to fix it. No one would have thanked you. A fire hazard doesn't wait for an invitation. I don't walk away from a fire." A long silence. They looked at each other, unblinking, unguarded. And then Isla smiled, a smile unlike any in her press file. Not for PR, not an act, just real. "Do you know who I am? Isla Harrington, Horizon Jetstream, the youngest woman to ever take a private airline into the Fortune 100. You don't sound impressed." Hudson shrugged. "I came to fix an engine, not to be impressed." Isla's smile deepened, like the first crack in a concrete wall built over many years. Then she turned back, looking straight at the group of engineers and directors who were watching with bated breath. "All of you, inside." No one dared to react. She didn't need to repeat herself. They silently retreated, like winds that had just passed. Now there were only two people on the runway. One who was a queen of the sky. One who was called in like the last mechanic on the list. And then Isla uttered something that perhaps she herself couldn't believe she was saying. "My whole life, I've been surrounded by people who talk a good game and do little. You're the first person to do the opposite." Hudson didn't reply. Not because he had nothing to say, but because sometimes silence is the most honest answer. The wind swept across the runway, swirling a few dry leaves around their feet. That moment, just a few short minutes, but it was long enough for two people from opposite ends of the world to realize that something was beginning, and that something was not in any plan. The distance between them was less than an arm's length, but in Isla's eyes, that distance felt as precarious as the gap between two worlds. She looked at Hudson Blake, the man with oil-stained hands, jeans torn at the knee, an old, frayed flannel shirt, and wondered why couldn't she look away from him. It wasn't his appearance, not his aura. It was because he had nothing to prove, so everything he did was real. She took a deep breath. Her voice lowered, but it seemed to pierce straight through every layer of armor he had ever worn. If I were to ask you something completely crazy, what would you do? Hudson didn't blink. He stood tall, as if he had just heard an interesting challenge, but his eyes held no contempt, no defense, just quietly waiting for her to continue. Isla swallowed hard. She wasn't used to saying things without calculation, but now, perhaps for the first time in her life, she wasn't calculating anything at all. What if I asked you to marry me? A gentle wind blew past. The sounds around them seemed to stop. Hudson didn't move, didn't laugh, didn't panic, didn't step back, just silence. For a long time. Then he tilted his head, softly. Are you serious? Isla nodded slightly. Her lips were pressed together as if holding back a wave of emotion that had just washed over her. You don't know anything about me. That's exactly why. I'm asking. Hudson frowned, not because he was confused, but because that answer was so unlike Isla Harrington. She was a symbol of control, reason, power. Yet now, in the middle of a morning full of sunlight and judgmental stares, she was making a proposal that every PR consultant in the world would scream to prevent. I've been proposed to 23 times, Isla continued, her voice lower, more real. All by men in suits, calculating assets, signing prenuptial agreements before they even confessed their feelings. She paused, her eyes never left Hudson's. And you showed up with a tool bag, saved my jet from exploding, asked for nothing, didn't introduce yourself. And when I asked if you knew who I was, you just said, I came to fix an engine, not to be impressed. Hudson frowned, then looked down at his hands, stained with oil, fingernails chipped, the smell of grease still strong. You want to marry a mechanic? Isla smiled, a soft, deep smile. I want to marry the only person here who isn't trying to impress me. Another silence. From the terminal, eyes watched from afar. A few phones were secretly recording, but Isla didn't care, because for the first time in years, she wasn't performing. She was just living. Hudson remained quiet. His eyes seemed to be searching for something larger than the marriage proposal. He was trying to understand the real person behind that gaze. Then he spoke. Slow, steady. If you're serious, then take off your shoes. Isla froze. What? Hudson pointed at the runway surface. If you really want to step into my world, then step into it with real feet. No pointed heels, no arrogance, no brands, 5 minutes, no job titles, no official positions, just 2 real people. Isla's gaze wavered for the first time. She wasn't being challenged by the media or shareholders, but by something simpler and more real than any meeting she had ever attended. She bent down, took off one shoe, Then the second. Her feet touched the hot concrete, a stinging sensation, but not as painful as the feeling of liberation. Isla Harrington, aviation icon, millionaire. The woman who lived in castles in the sky was now walking barefoot beside a mechanic. They strode on, without words, without caring who was watching. And just like that, they began to step into a world with no private runways, but with enough space for two bare souls to touch. They walked side by side, shoeless, without identity, without a guide. Hudson walked slowly, intentionally keeping the distance between them not too close, yet not too far. Isla kept pace with him. Each barefoot step felt like treading on a layer of memory she had long hidden away. Her feet, accustomed to the cold marble floors of high-end boardrooms, were now slightly burned by the runway surface heating up under the early sun. But Isla didn't cry out. She didn't even blink. She had never felt so light in her heart. Hudson led her toward the end of the runway, where a row of old hangars lay silent like a forgotten memory of the modern airport. Rusty tin roofs, faded wooden doors, and nameplates with nearly illegible letters. He stopped in front of a heavy iron door, pushing it open with a long creak that seemed to echo from a past decade. Inside, no airplanes, no high-tech equipment, only an old folding table, a dented metal chair, a few tools hanging on the wall, and most special of all, faded old photographs meticulously pinned to the wooden partition photos of wartime planes. A photo of a silver-haired man laughing heartily beside a young boy in a small mechanic's outfit. Isla walked slowly, her eyes scanning each photograph. "My father," Hudson said, his voice as deep and distant as a memory. "He fixed planes for the military. He also built this hangar with his own hands. When he passed, I didn't know what to do with it, so I just kept it. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, just old dreams and dust." Isla turned to look at him. This man's face showed no trace of insecurity or sadness, only truth. And truth is always as solid as steel. Hudson walked over to the folding table, pulled out a clean cloth, and invited her to sit. Isla didn't hesitate. She sat down, picked up a small photo, and looked at the man in the picture holding the young boy as if he were holding the whole world. "I grew up in places that had everything except warmth." Isla breathed softly. "My father also built an empire, but he didn't leave behind a hangar like this. He only left behind contracts." Hudson nodded slightly. He didn't ask for more. He just sat down beside her, at a distance that was close enough to listen without pressure. "You know," Isla turned the photo in her hands, "I don't need fireworks. I don't need a diamond ring. And I certainly don't need a lavish wedding. I just need to know the person beside me won't leave when everything burns down." Hudson looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not the one who brings fairy tales," he said. "I bring wrenches, oil-stained hands, an erratic repair schedule, and dinner is a cold sandwich next to a toolbox. I have nothing to give you." Isla looked at him for a long time, then smiled a strangely peaceful smile. "Then you're the first person to give me something I've never had." Hudson was taken aback. Give you what? Authenticity. No one spoke for a long moment. Outside, the world kept running, stocks rose, planes took off, phones buzzed non-stop. But inside the old hangar, time seemed to stand still. And then Hudson spoke this time, slower than usual. If you really want to step into my life, then don't expect roses every morning. But I promise I'll never give up halfway. Isla squinted as if trying to keep her emotions from spilling over. I might not need roses, she replied. But I need someone who knows how to remove the thorns when I no longer have the strength. Hudson let out a soft laugh. Not a joyful laugh, but the relieved chuckle of a man accustomed to living in solitude, who had unexpectedly found someone who understood his language. Well then, he said, let's see how many cracks we can patch up before the world finds out. Outside, the sun was high. Streaks of light shone through the gaps in the tin roof, scattering across the hangar floor like strokes of a golden brush painting a silent picture. Isla stood up from the folding chair, stretching lightly. Her bare feet were still on the dusty cement floor, but it seemed she no longer felt the burning sensation. The hard, rough, gritty feeling, it was real, and that was exactly what she needed. She had walked on marble floors in Dubai, on fur rugs in Geneva, on precious wood floors in Manhattan penthouses, but nowhere had she been able to touch the ground like this. Hudson was standing by the door, looking out at the distant runway. He heard her soft footsteps approaching. "Do you often bring women here?" Isla asked, her voice laced with a hint of humor. Hudson chuckled softly, without turning around. "No. Most people want to go straight to the conference room or the nearest fancy restaurant. Then why bring me here? Because you were the first one to take off your shoes without complaining." They both laughed briefly, but genuinely. A moment later, Isla stepped outside. The midday sun beat down on the airstrip, coating it in a layer of liquid glass. Hudson walked beside her, both still shoeless, as if testing whether the world would accept people without their glamorous outer shells. Their footsteps left faint marks on the cement, a CEO who once shook global shareholder meetings, and a man accustomed to living behind workshop walls. Two people, one rhythm. "Did you ever think you'd be standing next to someone like me?" Hudson didn't answer right away. He just glanced at her with the same quiet gaze as always. "I never thought I'd be standing next to anyone." Isla lowered her head slightly. That answer was not only real, it made her realize for all these years she had never walked beside anyone either. She walked ahead, walked alone, walked according to expectations, but never had a man quietly walked with her, not pushing her to go faster, nor pulling her back, just walked with her. On the way back, they passed the jet that had just been repaired. It now looked like a beast sleeping peacefully. No one was touching it anymore. It was as if the plane itself knew what it had just been through. A few employees stood at a distance. No one dared to come closer. A few phones were raised, but no one was smiling anymore, because the scene they were witnessing was unlike any news story. Isla Harrington, the icon of an era, The most powerful female executive in the aviation industry was walking barefoot beside an unknown man with no title, no brand name. She didn't avoid the cameras. She didn't cover her face. She just walked. And the faint smile that appeared on her lips, light as the wind, was the biggest statement she had ever made in her life. Not through a press release, not through a global press conference, just through one real step. The hangar door closed behind them, the heavy sound of metal echoing like a silent period mark for the world outside. Inside, there was only the pale light of the sun filtering through the blinds, casting streaks of light on the dust-covered walls and floor. The old photographs were still there, like witnesses to a time gone by. Isla slowed her pace, her eyes scanning each frame. One picture made her stop. It was a photo of a small boy, his face smudged with grime, wearing a mechanic's outfit, standing next to an older man with salt and pepper hair, his hand on his son's shoulder with a surprisingly radiant smile. "Is this?" Isla asked softly. Hudson nodded without needing to look. "My father, James Blake. And that kid there is me when I was just 7. Isla turned the photo in her hands, gently stroking the faded glass. "Was he a mechanic too?" "Not just a mechanic," Hudson replied, his voice deepening like the wind rustling through old pine trees. "He was the kind of man who looked at a dying machine and believed it still had a heartbeat." He walked over, pulled out an old iron chair, and sat down, his hands on his knees. "My father fixed planes for the Air Force for 3 decades, not a single accident, not a single error. When he retired, he bought this hangar, rebuilt it from the ruins, and started fixing planes for local farmers." He paused for a moment, his voice lowering. "The whole town said he was old-fashioned, that it wasn't profitable, but he said, 'You know, Hudson, not everything exists for profit. Some things exist because your heart won't let them die.'" Isla sat down opposite him, without speaking, without interrupting, just listening truly. Hudson looked at her for a long moment before continuing. "After he died, I couldn't sell this place, not because I was attached to the property, but because if I turned off the lights, the memories would go out too. So I kept it. I fixed it up, bit by bit, even though no one ever comes." Isla pressed her lips together. She turned to look at the photo again. The father's eyes in the picture were so warm, so steadfast, so real. No glamour, no stage, but complete. "I grew up in a place without a father like that," Isla said slowly. "My father also built an empire, but he didn't teach me how to keep a fire burning, only how to hold on to power." She looked up, her eyes meeting Hudson's. "The only things he left behind were numbers. But your father, he left behind something that lives on, even though he's gone." Hudson didn't reply immediately. He stood up, walked to a corner of the wall, pulled out a small wooden box, and placed it on the table. Inside was an old pocket watch, its hands long since stopped. "My father's watch," he said. "He always wore it when he worked. The hands stopped the moment he passed away. I didn't fix it, not because I couldn't, but because I wanted to preserve the exact moment his heart stopped beating." Isla stared at the watch. Her hand reached out, lightly touching the worn, faded glass. "It doesn't run anymore," she said. Hudson nodded. "But the memory still does, and I carry it with me." In that moment, Isla was no longer a CEO, no longer an aviation icon. She was just a woman seeing the value of a life lived authentically. And Hudson, the man who seemed to live only to fix engines, was now mending something deeper, her heart. The morning sunlight streamed into the old hangar through broken panes of glass, pouring onto the cold concrete floor like liquid honey, gentle and golden. There was no sound of an alarm clock, no 6 a.m. meeting, no assistant calling through a Bluetooth earpiece. There was only silence. Isla lay on her side on an old blanket, her hair messy, temporarily wearing an oversized flannel shirt, clearly Hudson's. Her expensive designer dress was folded neatly in a corner, covered by a thin layer of dust. Beside her, Hudson was sitting with his legs crossed, holding a steaming cup of coffee, a wrench still held loosely in his right hand. He didn't look at her, didn't ask if she was comfortable, didn't try to do anything gentlemanly by society's definition. He was just there, and that, in itself, was the greatest courtesy Isla had ever received. She stretched, sat up, took the old ceramic mug with a chip on its rim, and took a sip of the indescribably bitter coffee. Then she smiled. "Does the world know I'm here?" Hudson didn't turn around. "The world seems to be screaming because you've disappeared. But here, it's still quiet." Isla leaned her back against the wall, drew her knees up, and closed her eyes, savoring the cheap coffee that was, strangely enough, better than any drink a barista had ever made for her. "You know," she said, her voice hoarse from sleeping without a pillow, "I used to think I'd die if I went one day without being online. No reports, no meetings, no 5-year plans. And now, I just had the first night of my life, where I didn't dream about the third quarter financial report." They both laughed, a rare, raw sound that echoed between the old walls. At the same time, at the Horizon Jetstream headquarters, the entire office was in chaos. Advisors held an emergency meeting. The stock wavered slightly as the media leaked images of the mysteriously disappeared CEO suspected mental health issues. Some were even discussing a temporary transfer of executive power. Jason Merrick, the chief operating officer and Isla's right-hand man for a decade, stood in front of the conference room screen, pointing at a security camera image, a short clip showing Isla Harrington walking barefoot on the runway, followed by a strange man in a mechanic's uniform carrying a tool bag. "This is unacceptable," Jason growled. "She's destroying Horizon's image. The shareholders are demanding answers." A young director spoke up hesitantly. "But what if she's just searching for something real?" Jason spun around, his voice dripping with contempt. "She's a Harrington, and Harringtons don't live on feelings. They live on legacy." The room fell silent. Only one person said nothing. Evelyn Monroe, Isla's godmother, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. her eyes as sharp as steel behind round glasses. She clutched her teacup, not saying a word, only smiling very faintly, because she knew that girl had finally found her way. Back at the hangar, Isla put her cup down, her eyes fixed on the narrow doorway. If I don't go back, do you think they'll take my name off the headquarters? Hudson shrugged. Maybe, but a name can't live. A person needs to breathe. Isla turned to look at him, for a long time, not to judge, but as if she were pondering, how could an ordinary person say things that an entire boardroom never dared to think? Then I'll stay here for one more day, she said. To breathe? Hudson smiled, so faintly it was almost imperceptible. He raised his coffee cup. Welcome to a real sunrise. The sun had reached its peak. The sweltering heat on the runway made the cement strip seem to evaporate, but the air inside the hangar remained coolly silent until the sound of a high-end SUV's engine screeched outside the gate. Hudson was wiping down the fuel filter on an old Cessna when his hands froze. Isla stood behind him, still in the loose flannel shirt, holding a small wrench, her back stained with a few grease smudges. Though she said nothing, she knew from the sliver of view through the hangar door whose car that was. The heavy iron door burst open. Jason Merrick stepped inside, still in his expensive grey suit, a perfectly knotted tie, and polished glasses, but this time his expression was no longer confident. It was the look of a man facing something beyond his calculations. Isla, he said, his voice tense. What the hell are you doing? Isla didn't answer. She gently placed the wrench on the table and wiped her hands on a scrap of cloth. Her hands, which had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, were now stained with grease. But strangely, they had never felt so real. What are you doing here? Don't play games, Jason said, his voice tightening. The shareholders are furious. The media is in a frenzy. There are rumors you've been kidnapped. Some are even demanding a legal investigation. Hudson quietly stood up, not interfering. He just took one step back, not out of fear, but to give Isla the space to choose her own ground. Isla walked toward Jason, her gaze unwavering. I wasn't kidnapped. I left because I wanted to live. For the first time. Jason frowned. Live in this rust bucket, with a mechanic with no education, no background, no identity. Hudson heard it clearly, but didn't react. He had heard worse. But Isla was no longer silent. The man with no identity is the one who saved the multi-million-dollar jet, while you and your elite technical team were busy live streaming. Jason scoffed. You're betting everything on an emotional whim. Isla, you're a Harrington. You carry the name of an empire. You can't live like some country girl who falls for a mechanic and runs away from all responsibility. Isla held her head high. No, I'm not a Harrington anymore. I'm Isla, and I'm not running away. I'm choosing. Jason stepped closer, his eyes now tinged with anger. What about the board of directors? The stock, your responsibilities, the future you built with your blood and time, you're going to throw it all away for some guy who walked out of a storeroom. Isla turned back to look at Hudson, who was still standing silently by the hangar door, not defending her, not rushing in to argue, not reacting like a man trying to claim her. He just stood there, solid enough for her to lean on, yet distant enough for her to stand on her own. "I'm not throwing anything away," Isla said, turning to look Jason straight in the eye. "I just realized that for all these years, I wasn't building my future. I was building a dream that someone else designed, one that was imposed on me ever since I learned to read financial reports instead of fairy tales." Jason was speechless. Isla took another step forward, gently, but it was like a direct hit. "I've lived to be a role model. Now, I want to live to be myself." A metallic clang echoed from inside the workshop, like the final punctuation marking the end of an era. Jason had nothing left to say. He just glanced at Hudson this time, not with contempt, but with a look of helplessness. Then he turned on his heel and walked out of the hangar without looking back. Isla turned to Hudson without a word, but in her gaze was an entire declaration of independence just signed by her own oil-stained hands. Hudson walked over, stood beside her. They both watched the SUV leave the gate, leaving behind a woman who had just stepped out of her own shadow. Jason's SUV disappeared beyond the airport gate, leaving behind a void as heavy as a boulder in a space that was both quiet and on the verge of shattering. Isla stood still, her eyes still following it, as if wanting to watch for a long time the shadow of a part of her past that had just officially left her, the part of her past named having to be a proper Harrington. Hudson remained silent. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask. Now what? He gave her time to choose. And Isla chose. She turned to Hudson, decisively, needing no more time. "Come with me." Hudson raised an eyebrow, not alarmed, but clearly surprised. "Go where?" "Outside. In front of everyone. With me." A beat of silence. "Are you sure?" Isla nodded, her eyes shining not from the sunlight, but from the brilliant truth she had ignited herself for the first time in her life. "I want the whole world to know. I'm not ashamed to stand next to the first person who saw me without my last name or assets attached." Hudson didn't reply immediately. He looked down at his hands still stained with oil. He looked at her hair, messy, no makeup, wearing an old shirt, barefoot, but never had she looked so beautiful. And he nodded. They stepped out of the hangar. The afternoon light hit them hard from the front like a wall of gazes. Outside, a crowd had gathered at the airport gate. Employees, reporters, paparazzi, even a few uninvited shareholders. They surrounded the runway, lenses raised, microphones on, questions continuously shouted over the wind. "Isla, what are you doing? Who is that man? Is this a publicity stunt?" But Isla didn't blink. She squeezed Hudson's hand lightly, walking slowly, steadily, as if each step were a letter of resignation addressed to the entire system of expectations she had lived within. She wore no makeup, no diamonds, no designer dress, only a hand tightly grasping that of a man with no famous name, no profile, no PR. And that was the biggest message of all. "She's destroying everything," a shareholder muttered. "No," Evelyn Monroe Isla's godmother whispered, standing in the distance. "She's rebuilding from scratch for the first time, in her own way." Cameras flashed like fireworks. The questions grew more insistent, but Isla didn't stop. Hudson walked beside her, without a word, without bowing his head. He had never appeared in the media, never made it onto any 30 under 30 list. But his steps were as steady as if he had belonged here all along. And as they both walked past the Falcon 10X jet, the very plane Hudson had saved, a light breeze blew by, sending the hem of Isla's old flannel shirt fluttering like an invisible banner. Freedom doesn't need applause, it only needs to be lived. On social media, images of the pair spread like wildfire. Female CEO runs away with a mechanic. Isla Harrington, a new symbol of courage or a brand's downfall. Love or crisis. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a reason to judge. But only two people knew that moment did not belong to public opinion. It belonged to the truth. Isla took Hudson's hand and stepped onto the aircraft's stairs. Once again, just like this morning, she was stepping into the light. But this time, it wasn't for show. It was for freedom. The aircraft door closed behind Isla and Hudson with a deep, decisive sound, like a final period on an old chapter, and an opening mark for a different life. The noise outside was still there, but it was blocked out by the fuselage. Inside, there was only the sound of soft breathing, the faint hum of metal as the systems began to start up. Hudson sat in the seat by the window. Isla sat opposite him. They said nothing, but it was this silence that both of them had craved, a space where no one had to explain who they were. A moment later, the internal speaker came on. "Good afternoon, passengers. This is your captain. We are ready for takeoff. Where to, ladies and gentlemen?" Hudson looked over at Isla. She smiled the lightest, yet most genuine smile she had ever had in her life. "Anywhere we don't have to play a role," she replied. The plane shuddered lightly, accelerated down the runway, and then lifted off the ground, leaving behind all the numbers, all the gazes, all the standards. High in the sky, in the middle of an airspace with no nationality, where no regulation could imprison a person. Isla unbuttoned the top button of her shirt, stretched out her legs, leaned her head back against the seat, and breathed. A real breath. Not shallow, not fake, not to maintain an image. Hudson poured coffee from the old thermos, the one he always kept in his truck, into her plastic cup. She took a sip, grimacing. "Still as bitter as yesterday." "And still as real," Hudson replied. They both laughed. At the same time, in the Horizon Jetstream office, the executive board was in a panic, but no one dared to make a decision. On the financial news tickers, the stock fluctuated erratically, but in a quiet corner, Evelyn Monroe, Ila's godmother, silently closed her laptop, folded her file, and walked out of the conference room. A reporter stopped her in the lobby, asking, "Do you think Ila's actions are an emotional reaction or a media strategy?" Evelyn smiled, replying softly but clearly, "For the first time in 32 years, it's not a strategy. It's a real person." In the sky, the sunlight shining through the window made Ila's hair glow amber. Hudson looked at her and asked softly, "Are you sure you want to keep living like this? No extravagant engagement party, no mansion with servants, no one bowing when you walk in." Ila replied in a voice as light as a breath, "I've had all of that and still felt empty. But now all I have is a cup of bitter coffee, a rugged man, and a sense of peace I've never known. I think I'm finally starting to live for real." Hudson nodded. He said nothing more. He knew a woman like her didn't need to be saved. She just needed to be seen and to be trusted. As the plane glided through the clouds, Ila tilted her head to look down. She saw the skyscrapers shrink to the size of matchboxes, saw all the places that had once given her sleepless nights, now just tiny dots on a map. She turned to Hudson. "You know, I don't need the whole world to understand why I chose you, as long as I understand it myself." Hudson took her hand, squeezing it gently. "And I don't need to be loved like in the books. I just need to be loved without having to prove anything." In the cockpit, the pilot came on the intercom again. "We are at an altitude of 35,000 feet. The sky is clear today, and our destination, wherever the heart leads." And at that altitude, in a place free from the gravity of expectations, Isla Harrington was no longer a CEO, no longer an icon, no longer anyone but herself. A woman who knew for sure that some lives worth living are never planned, some right choices are never applauded, and some loves don't need the world's permission. Not everyone has the courage to leave the life that others have chosen for them, but one day, if you meet the person who makes you feel like you don't have to try to be anyone else, hold on to them tightly, because true happiness never needs the approval of the crowd. It only needs two people and an unadorned truth.